Yeah, let's now turn to the last part of today's session, which is a question and answer session, and perhaps a discussion among us. In any case, so let me suggest the following. So earlier, after Emily's talk, I had to tell Lorenzo to postpone his question. So maybe now is a good time to start with that. After that, we can perhaps take a question for Daniele, because there was no time after Daniele's talk. And then we can open up for questions by the online audience. So so Lorenzo, you had I think a comment or question to Emily.
Yeah, so my question is the following. So like, if I understood correctly, like these cross-perspective links constitute a completion of quantum theory. So you get a different, better theory. And then I was wondering, like, from the mathematical point of view, how this addition is defined, and then if you can provide experimental tests that can differentiate between quantum theory and this new theory.
Yeah, so mathematically, it's defined. Basically, just asserts an identity between the measurement result obtained by Bob and the measurement result obtained by Alice when Bob measures Alice in an appropriate basis. And as I said, the way we formulated it is reasonably vague in that we didn't specify very much about what kind of observable Bob needs to measure of Alice's to make sense of that. We just kind of assumed that there's an understanding of what counts as a measurement on Alice, which establishes something about her measurement result. I don't find that very satisfactory. I would like to see a sort of more developed version which sort of says something more specific about what observable Bob is measuring specifically. So that's why I say this is kind of a sketch of what needs to be done rather than a full completion of the theory. With regards to experimental evidence, no, there's no experimental evidence which can distinguish between these views, because the whole problem with the original view was that it was totally unconfirmable and that there was no experimental evidence that could ever sort of provide evidence for or against quantum mechanics as formulated in this view. So the point of adding cross-perspective links doesn't give you something that's empirically different. It gives you something that it's rational to believe in. So your first-person experiences will be the same either way, but by adding cross-perspective links, that allows you to believe that your first-person experiences are related to other first-person experiences, and thus to use the evidence in the way that we do in fact use evidence to confirm quantum mechanics.
So is it correct that maybe it's better to call it an interpretation of the theory more than a completion? Or
I would refer to interpretation as something which doesn't add anything to the theory. And cross-perspective links does involve adding something to the theory because it requires this additional mathematical structure which is not there in standard quantum mechanics. But it is empirically very similar, because we are limited to using our first-person experience. A postulate which postulates relations between different first-person experiences won't have any empirical difference, but it is a different theory which asserts different things about the world and the network of perspectives that make up the theory.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Great. Now let's go to Daniele's talk and questions for Daniele. Again, Emily, was this a raised hand? Yes. So please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I have one comment and one question. So you mentioned concern about how non-Humean primitivist accounts of law would work in a quantum gravity context, because many of the existing ones seem to presuppose a time evolution initial value formulation. I mean, I have been worried about the exact same thing, so you might perhaps be interested in recent work by me and a similar piece by Eddie Chen, trying to establish how to make a non-Humean view of lawhood work in a context that doesn't assume time evolution or a sort of generation picture. So that is very doable, and so that's not really an advantage of Humeanism over non-Humeanism. It's equally easy to do it in a non-Humean way if you formulate your non-Humean view in the same way. So the question I have is basically the same question that I ask all Humeans. So for me, the important difference between accidental regularities and laws is that I form expectations about the future based on laws and not based on accidental regularity. So if laws are just laws because we have chosen to take a certain epistemic attitude towards them, how would it possibly be rational to form expectations about the future based on laws? Wouldn't that just be a crazy form of self-delusion?
So you're asking what is the ground for rational expectations in a best system type context?
Yeah, I mean, the difference between accidental regularities and laws to me is that I base expectations about the future on laws and not on accidental regularities. But if laws are just accidental regularities that we've chosen to take a certain attitude towards, how can that possibly be a rational thing to do?
I think from my personal point of view, this is in fact another way of stating the general problem with the best system approach, that you have no ground to really justify calling a given system the best one in some sort of metaphysically loaded way, and you have to accept that the best system you use and that defines for you laws is your chosen best system. It's an entirely epistemic move to declare a system the best, and you're really putting just avoiding to add what you should, which is the best system we currently have. So again, the only way to solve this type of issues is to decrease expectations, so to speak, and to move everything to the domain of agents accounting for their own experiences and devising the best explanatory scheme in the form of a particular model. And then your question will have to be phrased in the context of theories of rationality, but it's or decision theory. What makes a model better than another one? But it becomes entirely inside a question within epistemology. It's not anymore a question about laws as such.
But I mean, I think that's my concern, is that if it is just a question about epistemology, it couldn't possibly be rational to use laws to infer things about the future, because now you're saying that a law is just the best formulation, best description of the things I have observed in the past. It has nothing to tell me at all about what's going to happen in the future.
Sure, there's the usual issue with induction, and to some extent, it's so. Is it rational to rely on our current theories of physics to guide us towards what we are going to observe tomorrow in the lab? And there should be a way to make your statement, which is abstractly true, with the other statement, which is that with the factual experience that most of the time our theories in fact work, and that's sort of the ground for being rational to rely on them. But of course, it has to be. It becomes a matter of how reliable is a model. Is a different notion that any capital R rationality.
Well, it's not just about reliability, though, because if the law is really just descriptive, there's no reason to think that the law has anything at all, reliable or unreliable to say.
From this point of view, in all this epistemic view or program for laws, depending on what you were asking for, then it becomes indistinguishable. It can become indistinguishable from simply law anti-realism. So you're simply saying that the moment you go epistemic, you have to translate a bunch of questions about laws into a bunch of questions about how we construct models, to what extent we establish the fact that they're reliable, how we compare them, and so on. So in that language, you simply don't need to speak about laws anymore. It's a different type of problem. So from this point of view, you could say, well, you're simply stating that laws do not exist, which is true. But we, as I mentioned in the talk, we routinely refer to laws as extracted from our best current models. In that sense, establishing reliability or rationality of trust in laws it's a word endeavor, but it has to do with explaining why a particular law-like system is explanatory, establishing to what extent it accounts for puzzling observations. The usual questions in scientific modeling. I hope that helps.
So before going to Lorenzo, let me jump in here and ask something that has also, in other words, shown up as a question asked by the audience. That's why I'm asking it now. So it seems that when you take a view of physical laws as ontological primitives, that this gives you something, namely it basically explains why it is possible to have cognitive tools in the first place. It kind of gives a justification for expecting that induction is possible in the first place, and that it might be a good idea to be a Bayesian. Now, when you reject this and say, let's have view as physical theories as cognitive tools to begin with, what do you do with that? How do you replace, like, how would you then go for answering this question? Wouldn't it be a miracle somehow, so that it still works to have a cognitive tool at all?
So it's in a way it's closely related to what Emily was asking.
Yes, yes.
It has to do with why it should then be rational to use a particular law for future predictions if they don't have any ontological basis. Is the ontological part of this counterpart to the same question?
Well, yes, or any law at all. I mean, maybe we don't know these fundamental laws yet, but the very fact that we find some good approximations to them, that already would be mysterious then, if you don't assume that they are fundamental ones, even if you don't know them. Sorry for interrupting.
I don't have the answer to that. I can tell you my attitude towards that. I'm saying that my attitude is, if I have to spend intellectual energies in solving this problem, I would rather frame it as a psychological one. Meaning, I understand, of course, how easy living in a world in which there are laws out there, and we may not know them, but they govern the world and they justify, experience and so on. I understand all of that. And I understand, therefore, the challenge of relinquishing that safety net, and being just thrown out in the world in which we just have to make sense of things, and we know it can fail tomorrow, and we don't really have any absolute basis for trust in our models and so on. I would rather invest in psychological counseling, so to speak, and help us, getting used to the idea and trying to really settle, trying to really advance on the more epistemological issues and that we were mentioning, that I was mentioning, talking with Emily, rather than saying, well, given all this difficulty, no, I want to go back to my.
That's a great answer. Thanks. Now, Lorenzo, you've raised your hand. Oh, by the way, welcome back. Good to have you back. But Lorenzo, you raised your hand.
Yeah, so actually still related a bit to this, so according to this view that laws are epistemic, but I guess still there is some possibility of, reality and external world. And one of the possibility that you contemplated was this participatory realism, that, if I'm not wrong, this idea that every time there is new reality creating, maybe with some new laws, but still, wouldn't it be possible in this, not just in this view, but also in other views that you might have, that actually there are in the end some laws that explain the consistency between the previous reality and the new reality, for example, that in this case they would be ontic. So would you contemplate the idea that, okay, maybe the laws we have now, I don't know, conservation of energy or something, these are epistemic, but actually there might be other laws that, I don't know, maybe are not about the actual world we see, but there are consistency laws between realities or structural laws that actually are ontic?
Yes, there's nothing in what I said and that would contradict not only that possibility, so the fact that there may be consistency constraints that somehow relate the reality created in a given interaction with the reality created in another one. But also, so the answer is yes, I agree. That's certainly a possibility. I cannot come up at the moment with an example of how such a law would look like. But on top of that, I would also add the other possibility that, as we mentioned already in previous discussion, the fact that even after we accept that the facts are relative to some extent, or perspectival, and that is another ingredient of this view on laws as well, and instantiated in some interpretations of quantum mechanics. But I would say that we still have to strive for at least the possibility of maps across all such views, and those maps can be also promoted to law-like status in principle. I would say that even there, it would be very dangerous to simply assume that once we found a certain set of translation maps that seem to work across subjects, those maps should just be understood as being out there and so on. I think the question would be raised in similar terms also to those. But certainly the possibility of such laws, sort of meta laws, is not excluded by anything I said in the analysis of standard low-level laws.
Great. So Emily is raising her hand. So maybe this can be the last question to Daniele before we go to questions from the audience. We already have one here, which we will do next. But now, Emily, it's your turn. We can hear you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a bit more about this possibility of translation maps, because I wanted to know how you spoke about when we find that a translation map works. But I mean, how are we ever supposed to tell that a translation map works? We're all of us inside a single perspective only. We can never go to another perspective and check that the translation map works. So I don't entirely understand how you can do without a third-person external reality grounding some kind of shared reality, because you can never otherwise have any reason to think there's any relation between your perspective and someone else's.
I agree, but it seems to me the same question that we could ask about any, not only any scientific model, but any proposed law. How do you know that it actually captures the whole reality of the system you're talking about? And we don't. We try. I mean, we try to see what consequences come out. We try to see if there is any element that has been missing by asking more questions, by changing the context of application of the law, by seeing.
But I mean, this is a very different situation, because in an ordinary case, I can test my law by doing more tests and looking at the results. But in the case of proposed translation maps between perspectives, I can never do a single test on that, because I can never go see any other perspective. So you have no empirical grounds at all to postulate these translation maps.
How do I know that I am understanding you properly? I translated what you said to me, and I elaborated on it. I say, okay, she means that and that. That means she has that and that in mind, and she has that and that experience of what I said earlier. Then if I want to check, I ask you back.
Right, but you never gain any access to my perspective, so you never have any grounds for drawing any scientific conclusions about the accuracy or not of those translations.
I agree, that's certainly true, but it's exactly, it seems to me, the counterpart of saying, yes, you can ask whatever questions you want about the world with your model, with your experiments, but there's nothing that will guarantee you that you actually are accessing the actual reality out there. Yes, you keep testing the world, but you're always somehow at the interface with reality, and you're never accessing it properly. Yes, if that's what you mean by reality, yes, it's forever outside. And your own experience, if that's what you mean, whatever could be possibly left that is not translatable at all, and there's no further interaction between worlds that will show it. Yes, okay, then by definition, it's out of the picture.
Okay, very good. So we have one very long question to Emily. Emily, are you ready? The question is from Czaslaw, and I will read it because it's a couple of lines. So Czaslaw asks the following. As far as I understand, in orthodox interpretations, different observers share the same facts in all standard solutions, where they have access to the same records. Only in the Wigner-friend situation, this is no longer the case. But even then, if Wigner and the friend are to compare their respective facts to achieve intersubjectivity, that is, Wigner decides to make the same measurement as the friend, they would report the same fact. What the no-go theorem states is that when comparing their facts, the friend may report a result that is not the same as what she saw before Wigner made the measurement. However, this is irrelevant for the act of comparison of their results. So intersubjectivity is always guaranteed when the two observers want to compare their results or communicate. Do you agree?
Yeah. This is a common error made by proponents of orthodox interpretations. There's a claim that in every case except where I can prove a no-go theorem showing that intersubjectivity is impossible, we do have intersubjectivity. But that is absolutely not what the orthodox interpretations tell us, because the orthodox interpretations tell us that all facts are relative, and therefore if you want there to be relations between different perspectives, you need to have something to say about where those facts come from and how intersubjectivity arises. And you can't get that by appeal to unitary quantum mechanics, because ex hypothesi in an orthodox interpretation, all unitary quantum mechanics does is tell you how to describe the world from the perspective of each individual observer. So if you want to have any relations between those different perspectives, you have to put them in somehow. You can't just assume they're there. So there's a confusion going on here, because orthodox interpretation people both want to say there are no observer-independent facts, but also want to assume that there are observer-independent facts about the relations between perspectives in the situations where they think that there should be. And they want to say the only case where intersubjectivity fails is where there's a no-go theorem showing that it does. But the dialectic is the other way around. Intersubjectivity isn't there in these interpretations unless you can explicitly show that it is there. And none of these interpretations have done that.
So may I ask back, Emily? So when you say that, I wonder what kind of what kind of mechanism, say, you would want to have in order to say that here intersubjectivity arises. You had these, you've described one, but on the other hand, you could perhaps ask the same question in the context of classical physics. If you don't know anything about the initial conditions of the universe or the conditions around us and just know that you have Newton's laws or Hamiltonian mechanics, then I don't see how this would guarantee that the conditions are such that we have the possibility for intersubjectivity. Or even something you also criticized the cubists for, even persistent records. We could be living in a completely chaotic world. So in some sense, aren't you perhaps demanding too much here? Or when would you be satisfied by the orthodox interpretations?
So one very easy way to get into subjectivity is to say, well, there exists an observer-independent reality, which we are all located in, and thus when we align ourselves in an appropriate way, we will both be observing the same observer-independent fact, and we will thus end up sharing those facts. So in a scenario where we have an observer-independent reality, yes, there can be failures in communication, but there are well-established methods by which we can bring our perspectives into alignment, because our perspectives are both perspectives on the same observer-independent reality. If you don't want to postulate an observer-independent reality, the problem is much more complex, because then you can't rely on observer-independent facts to bring those perspectives into alignment. You're going to have to add something into your theory to bring perspectives into agreement in some way. So the cross-perspectives link postulate is one way to do that. As I said, I don't think it's entirely satisfactory yet. It's slightly ad hoc, but it's kind of showing the kind of thing that you would need to postulate in order to make sense of this. And I would like to see more work done on putting that on a sort of more formal basis and understanding the nature of the variables involved. With respect to the stability of records over time, indeed, that's not another thing you can sort of prove on the basis of your observation. Basically, I think that there are certain assumptions we need to make in science in order to ground the rationality of science. We need to assume some level of intersubjectivity. We need to assume some level of stability of records. And thus, any theory we come up with on the basis of science needs to affirm those assumptions, needs to say, yes, we were right to make those assumptions. Otherwise, it undermines itself. So if you make those assumptions and then come up with a theory which says they're false, something's gone wrong. You need to start again and reconsider your approach, because your theory must be consistent with the assumptions that you made to arrive at it.
Okay, thank you. So we have a bit of time left, so let me quickly go follow up with clarification, Emily, on your cross-perspectival links.
Yeah.
So as I understand it, so I would guess the following. I would guess when you tell this to the standard physicists, they would tell you, but come on, this is not something you would want to postulate, it's a theorem. And then it would probably point to some things that people have proven, like maybe some about decoherence or quantum Darwinism and how records can proliferate. But if I understand correctly, then you would reject this in some sense, because it would pre-assume already some level of intersubjectivity that the orthodox interpretations don't specifically postulate or cannot explain. Is that correct?
Yeah, decoherence is no help at all with this problem, because decoherence applies within a perspective. Decoherence says nothing about the relations between perspectives, because in an orthodox interpretation, unitary quantum mechanics is a tool that can be used by a single observer to describe their own perspective. Decoherence can only occur inside a single perspective. It can't relate different perspectives. Now, if you add something like cross-perspective links and you combine that with decoherence, then you have a very nice picture, because then each observer has their own sort of quasi-classical reality, and cross-perspective links allows those different quasi-classical realities to be brought into alignment. And so decoherence plus cross-perspective links gives you this nice sort of emergent shared reality which everybody can agree on. So decoherence is an important part of that story, but it's definitely not enough on its own.
Okay, thank you very much. So Jacques, you've been raising your hand for a while.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to comment on this point of there's this discussion about, do we need to add something into these interpretations, in order to get some notion of shared perspectives and shared facts. And I think it's not so important to, maybe it's important to some people to say our interpretation doesn't add anything to quantum theory. But personally, I think all interpretations are at least a minimal addition to the theory, because any theory means nothing unless it's interpreted. We have to bridge it with actual experience of scientists using it. So in a certain sense, just by interpreting the theory, we're already adding to it. Now, the real question to me is what needs to be added and how. And as I said earlier, Emily, I think whereas you tend to emphasize adding something with an absolute ontological significance, that there is a cross-perspective link that forms a shared fact, to me, I would prefer to interpret such an ontological claim more in an epistemological way, and say that when I say there is a shared fact, what I really mean is that if anyone tries to verify that, we expect them to get the same thing that we get. So to me, that opens up interesting avenues for further investigation. What do we mean by tries to verify? What do we mean by anyone? Who fits that description? And so to me, it seems much more productive to think in this manner than to just say, this is absolutely true, and leave it at that. Also, of course, my way of thinking about it fits much better with the first-person interpretation like cubism.
Yeah, so two things in response. So the problem with the claim that quantum mechanics is complete and universal and nothing needs to be added is that it ends up being used as an excuse to not do any more work, to just say quantum mechanics is fine the way it is. We don't have to figure out how to make intersubjectivity work. We can just say we're done. And my argument is just that the work does need to be done. There's still things to do. This needs to be worked out in some way. With respect to the second point, the claim you're making seems to be close to the claim that some proponents of orthodox interpretations make, that internally consistent descriptions is enough. And as I said at the beginning of my talk, it is a prediction of unitary quantum mechanics that each observer will, have internally consistent descriptions, and when they try to ask other observers about their experience, they will always hear the observers as saying something which is consistent with their own experience. But what I was trying to argue in my talk is that on its own is not enough to ground our practice of empirical confirmation. You need something more than that, which relates perspectives and doesn't just It doesn't just give you consistency within a single perspective. And so that's the reason why I think that just epistemic sort of first-person claims are not enough to ground the epistemology of science. You do need some kind of objective facts about the relations between perspectives. I mean, they can be entirely relational facts. I'm perfectly happy with a fully relational third-person reality, but they do need to be more than just first-person facts.
Okay, very nice. So we have one more question now to Jacques, actually, from the audience. Question begins with, couldn't we leave the philosophy aside? And then it continues by saying that sharing is what happens when the accounts of a situation by two agents are consistent with one another, given their respective perspectives. So that's also something I was wondering before, whether what you're looking for is better phrased in technical terms, that it's perhaps not that relevant that this is a living being, the cat, but perhaps the cat could also be something else which is not a living being. Yeah. What do you think?
So, yeah, there's different parts to that. Look, I'm sympathetic to saying, can't we leave philosophy aside? And frankly, I think I'm only here bringing up philosophy because I feel like there's no other way. But the end goal is to get rid of the philosophy and come back to something that feels a bit more like good old physics, you know. However, I do think these issues are important exactly because our philosophical point of view guides the kind of questions that we ask and also guides the kinds of answers that we'll find satisfactory. And with regards to this living being thing, I have to admit that perhaps it's a bit too strong, or at least the word living has too many connotations. I would really rather use something more flexible because I do think it could apply to something like an AI. So, you know, something made of electronics could behave in such a way that when you look at it, you feel like, well, I'm dealing with, quote, a living being. It feels alive to you in your perception. And to me, that should qualify because for me, the standard is a subjective one. You know, if you relate to it as an agent the same way you would to another person, for me, the Turing test is not a necessary condition for intelligence. It's also sufficient, which is maybe a bit of an extreme view, but I do feel like the philosophical standpoint that I'm coming from commits me to that.
Yes, so I feel like I could come up with so many science fiction scenarios, like, you know, a single human is just raised by robot parents or something, that could question whether you really want to make the specific philosophical assumptions. But I take what you said for now, and thanks.
I will just say, life. When we talk about what's alive, we're touching on the deep question of what is life, and is life necessarily something to do with you know, meat and organs, or can it be electronic?
Yes, and since we're probably going off the rails with that, let me get to the next question from the audience for Daniele this time. The question is, how is your definition of what constitutes an agent not merely the result of intuition and analogy to humans, as opposed to being substantiated by objective argumentation? Yeah, so, yeah.
So, well, to some extent, we are striving to start from examples of agency, and of course, a prominent one is human agency and highly complex cognitive agents. But also to, you know, starting from there, but trying to strip off elements until you know, we are left with something that is minimal enough that if we were further removing ingredients, then we would lose something essential to the notion of agency. And so, yeah, to some extent, you can definitely see human agency in our definition, just like the goal is that you see any other type of agency in the same definition, but there's a minimal condition for recognizing agency. All the rest being a further refinement of the definition. So we aim for a sort of setting the boundary between what could possibly be agent an agency and what definitely is not, because it's missing some minimal conditions, some necessary minimal condition. And then within that boundary, indeed, we are trying to add conditions to have a more proper classification of agency. And so in a sense, human agency certainly is not just what our definition captures, because indeed human agency has many more ingredients than what we just say. In that sense, we are not simply translating, from one word into another, the definition of human agency. That's certainly not the case. What is the case is that human agency fits with that condition as a bare minimum. This is only useful to the extent in which our definition is both broad enough to include all sorts of known agents, but at the same time not so empty to cover any physical system whatsoever. If we manage to do that, then rely on that notion of agency already may rule out some possible interpretations of quantum mechanics.
Mm-hmm. So maybe as a quick follow-up on this, do you think you could draw inspiration already from Bayesian epistemology? So I don't know the field very much, but has there been maybe something said already about what users should have or properties they should have to actually use Bayesian reasoning in the first place or so?
Yes, so one of the reasons why that part of the project is very much in progress, that I also don't know so much about Bayesian epistemology, so I'm studying. But yes, as far as I know, these are also questions that have been already addressed. So there are, you can have preliminary motivation for using that framework as a good way of characterizing a normative, mostly normative view on laws, which is then the basis for an epistemic view. I would not be able to point to the literature and really explain it properly, but I can point you to people who know more, which is what I do often.
So that would be interesting. Thank you. So the time is slowly running out. Maybe we have perhaps 5 more minutes or so. So let's do 1 or 2 final questions. So let me read one question for Lorenzo. Can you classically reproduce the double-slit experiment results? If so, are the recent Bohr, Bush, and Batelan bouncing droplet experiments, oh wow, what is this? Which ostensibly refute classical interpretations of interference in the double-slit experiment relevant? I don't know about these experiments. I'm not sure if you...
Yeah, no, I don't know either. It rings a bell somehow, but I don't know. But I mean, the only answer I can say is that it's very. I mean, if you deviate even slightly from the configurations I just given in the talk, you already cannot reproduce it in the toy field theory. And actually, the last result I was showing is that probably you can relate them to having this functional form of the wave-particle duality relation not being linear.
Yeah, maybe it's something like that.
Yeah, other than that, I'm not sure what to say. I'm sorry. I'm happy to, if send me an email to read about this experiment and think more about that.
You would expect that the experiment is somehow a continuous thing, and your toy model is a bit discrete, so that you easily pass the boundary towards contextuality there. But I don't know. So
yeah, maybe you can develop a discrete version of that experiment, and But yeah, I mean, I just suspect that either you reduce it to the one I just showed, to this trap phenomenology, or it's gonna be some contextual scenario.
Okay, so the person who has asked that, please send an email to Lorenzo, tell him the reference, maybe find out more.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's say, what else do we have? So here's a question to Daniele. In an ontology of relations, the entities that relate are themselves relations. So you get relations of relations of relations. How does this not fall into infinite regress if there are no absolutes to ground the relations? Not sure how this directly relates to your talk.
I think it relates to my talk because I said that quantum mechanics is about relations, and that the subject matter of quantum mechanics. I'm not sure that one is to necessarily push it to an ontology that is only about relations without the relata. It's enough to have to make the point that the relata are going to be defined. They cannot be defined in absence of the relations, but it doesn't mean that there are no such thing as objects. So to some extent, when we talk about participatory realism, we're not denying the existence of the physical systems out there. We're just saying that any characterization of what is the reality of those systems requires that we enter in some relation with them, which is it's something weaker than that. We're not denying that there is there are things out there. We are denying that there are intrinsic properties of those systems, and that properties are always relational.
Yes, okay. Yeah,
that's how I understand the question,
yeah.
how we react to it.
Yes. So Jacques already also raised his hand. So if you can be brief, that'd be good because we're running out of time.
Yeah, so I don't know how much this agrees with what Daniele was saying, but I think the way I tend to think about it from a cubist point of view is that there are certain kinds of relations which are the root relations, the ones which are not themselves relations of further relations. And I would characterize those as what the phenomenologists, the philosophers of phenomenology call perceptual relata. Basically what relates to the subjective experiences of being embedded in a world and taking actions in it and so on. And they do make a case that these relational experiences are in some sense fundamental. They're not reducible to further relations. But that's all.
Maybe that's a good last statement if I relate to my clock now. So we're kind of running out of time. But I think, let me thank so much all of you, Emily, Jacques, Daniele, and Lorenzo. This was a really nice discussion, and thanks for your great talks. As an announcement, so all the videos of your talks will be available on Essentia Foundation's YouTube channel of today and yesterday. So for those in the audience who didn't have the chance to follow all the talks, this is your chance to watch them later on. So let me thank again all the speakers of both days. And let me thank everybody who joined us over Zoom. And I hope you took something from it and you understand a bit better, even less than before, what quantum theory has to do with the first-person perspective. With that, I would like to say goodbye and have a good evening, and then bye-bye. Ciao.